Towards the end of the 50s, the fashion was very conservative, but as the 60s were approaching, American society started to change, along with the fashion. The new fashion showed off elegance and style, and the women of this decade wanted this look. The 60s started off with the election of John F. Kennedy. His wife Jacqueline Kennedy was known as one of the most stylish first ladies in history. She brought the idea of the pillbox hat, classy and chic dresses, which soon became a desirable fashion trend. In the early 60s, women wore the famous Jackie Kennedy look, including suits with short, boxy jackets and oversized buttons. The men's fashion was also changing. They wore wide ties and trouser straps. They also wore leather boots and collarless jackets. Hats were also very popular in the early 60s. As the 60s were moving along, youth cultures became more popular. The use of recreational drugs became a norm, which caused the psychedelic phase of the 60s. The fashion included bold colors and patterns, including stripes, polka dots, and paisleys. Also, it consisted of geometric shapes or abstract art. Also, people wore a lot of tie-dye. Also, go-go boots paired with vibrant color stockings or tights with colored miniskirts with bold patterns were a typical outfit. These fashions were popular in the fashion magazines, but also normal people wore these trends on the streets. Both men and women enjoyed these psychedelic styles. As the 60s progressed, the mod style made an appearance. This style was known as the space look, which included bold patterns, box-shaped dresses, and shiny fabrics. During this time, fashion was influenced most by the style icon Twiggy. She was said to have made the fashion trend more famous because everyone wanted to look like her. Her famous look was her thin figure, boyish hair, and long, beautiful eyelashes. As the 60s moved forward, the hemlines of dresses and skirts became shorter. Mary Quint also introduced the miniskirt, which became a rage. Everyone was wearing this miniskirt. They also wore it with go-go boots, which had become very popular, and hair became very long. Influences from the rock and roll music impacted fashions by saying it was okay to wear crazy prints, platform shoes, and bizarre outfits. After the death of Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968, people took a more active role in politics, which led to more experimenting with trends. Then by 1969, the hippie movement began. Long hair was a trend for both women and men. Beads, bell-bottom jeans, tie-dye shirts, headbands, and sandals were very popular too. Long flowy skirts paired with bangles and scarves became in style. Hippies wore anything that gave off the flower power vibe. The youth in the 60s showed their rebellious side through their fashion. They changed very frequently. One day they would show their legs, breasts, and their behinds, and then the next day they would cover everything up with long skirts, scarves, jewelry, and boots. The most major theme expressed in music of the 60s was the British invasion of American music. Numerous British groups came to the U.S. during the early 1960s. The British invasion included the leader, the Beatles. The Beatles were enormously popular during this time, and their popularity became known as the Beatlemania.
Now tell me the truth, are you really a Beatles fan, or are you here because it's the right thing to do?
I love the Beatles.
I bet there's a group you like better now.
No, I don't like any group better than the Beatles.
Other than the Beatles, the Dave Clark Five band, the Rolling Stones, and Dusty Springfield were also popular during the British invasion. Next came the Motown music. Motown is a recording company originally founded by Berry Gordy. The Motown became the most successful black-owned recording company in the history of American music. Motown's sound was soul-based that had a distinct pop influence. The Temptations, Martha Reeves, and the Vandellas, and Diana Ross were very popular. Another theme is rock and roll. The use of drugs definitely was associated with rock and roll in the late 1960s. Popular musicians during the rock and roll time were Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix, The Doors, Steppenwolf, and many more. Musicians like Jimi Hendrix and the lead singer of The Doors both died from drug overdose. Recreation in the 60s included that children watched television shows such as The Munsters and Sesame Street, while adults could watch the news about the Vietnam War or dance scene. Music was one of the most popular, which included the Beatles. Drive-in movies were very popular too, as well as the movie The Sound of Music, which won 5 Academy Awards, including the Best Film. Bonnie and Clyde also came out on film. Also, movies focused on the changes happening in the world. During the hippie era, there were anti-war rallies, large concerts, and the best ones were outdoors, including Woodstock Music Festival, where hundreds of thousands of people came to a 3-day concert that involved a lot of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. It became the icon of the 1960 hippie movement. Also, the American youth in the 60s turned to drugs. The average age of drug users was from 12-year-old school kids to college seniors. Sports were also very popular. Football became admired, baseball and hockey became a bigger deal, along with basketball. Golf also became widespread. The popular dance that was during this decade was the twist. The foot was in action to look like it was tapping something out on the floor. While dancing the twist, the two dancers never contacted each other. Food included showy and complicated food with French influence and a lot of backyard barbecues. Also, this was the decade of flaming things, including fondue. Fast food was also huge in this decade. Many new things came out of this decade, including Mrs. Butterworth syrup, Tap soda, Lucky Charms, Pop-Tarts, Apple Jacks, SpaghettiOs, Doritos, and Pringles. Politics were important to the American people. First, the 60s started out with the election of John F. Kennedy. People were fascinated with him. Some values in the 1960s were independence, equality, and the movement away from the conservative 50s. The need for peace and equality turned into the hippie era. The people in this subculture were known as hippies, but also they were known as flower children, love children, gentle people, or free people. Some of these hippies were young, who had run away from their parents. Some were also hardcore drug users, and some were psychotic. But more than half were mature people who spent at least a year in college and had held responsible jobs in the business world or in academics. Even though some choose to live on the streets, some hippies came from wealthy backgrounds. The idea of being single was very common. Women chose to be single to seek glamorous and challenging jobs. This started the idea of singles-only resorts or singles-only apartment housing. With the idea of being single, computerized dating agencies were established. Some movements of the 1960s are the counterculture or social revelation, which moved toward liberation in society. Anti-war movement, which included a kind of protest called a sit-in, the gay rights movement, Black Power movement, which was the coming together of black people to fight for their liberation by any means necessary. And the most important movement was the African American civil rights. The anti-war movement was the most popular. Americans would protest that they did not want the war in Vietnam and wanted peace. While men died on the battlefield, Americans protested by sit-ins for peace or produced anti-war musical shows. But this also led to the anti-protest protests. Not all Americans hated the war in Vietnam. More women than ever were entering the paid workforce, but this increased the unhappiness among women regarding the gender differences in pay and advancement, and also sexual harassment at the workplace. Women wanted equal pay for equal work, an end to domestic violence, an end to sexual harassment, and the sharing of housework and raising the children. Colored people during the 1960s faced discrimination and segregation. Also, Martin Luther King Jr. made the famous speech, "I Have a Dream," on August 28, 1963. This demanded equal rights for blacks and whites. In 1964, the first civil rights bill passed to stop racial discrimination. Then the Civil Rights Act of 1968 passed, which banned discrimination in the sale or rental of housing. Some slang in the 1960s include aghast, which means a lot of fun, ape, which means to go insane, bag, which means to steal, twitching, which means good, exciting, or awesome, blitz, which means drunk, ditz, which means an idiot, wigging out, which means going crazy, and also slugbug, which you said this when you saw a VW Beetle on the road. A typical day for a high school student is that they would go to school during the day. Few teenagers had jobs while in high school. Teenagers stayed innocent, went to bed early, and got up early, and they did not sleep in on the weekends. Schools provided sports, music, and art programs. They do not have that much homework. There were drugs, but they weren't as much as a problem. For recreation, they went to movies, skating rinks, bowling, sports games, dancing, or music. They watched television in the evenings together. Takeout dinners were not the norm, and families ate dinner together. They were allowed to stay out long after dark.
The biggest thing was the fact that John F. Kennedy, President of the United States, was shot while he was in a parade in Dallas. He was with his wife. He was sitting up with the top down in the convertible, and somebody from far away, from behind a warehouse, shot at him, and he slumped over. They raced him to the hospital, and then they just waited. Well, I was teaching school in Phoenix, Arizona, 3rd grade, and all of a sudden the intercom comes on and they said, "We have some sad news. Our president was just shot. We don't know any of the details yet. They've raced him to the hospital. They don't know how serious it is, but we'll keep you posted." All the kids said, "What?" They started talking, and I said, "Well, I think maybe we should bow our heads and say a prayer that he's okay." And so then we just said, we'll just have to wait and see what happens. But nobody was really interested in learning anything. So we just visited and wondered what happened, talked about what could have happened, etc. And then about, I guess it was an hour later, they announced that he had died. It was a sad time in our history.
In the 60s, the most important and influential inventions in technology were the audio cassette, soft contact lenses, the compact disc, a first handheld calculator, the computer mouse, an artificial heart, the ATM, and the barcode scanner. Also, the computer age started. The computer of this decade could now calculate millions of times faster than the creator. A big scientific discovery in the 60s was cracking the genetic code. This era was huge for space discovery. President John F. Kennedy's goal of reaching the moon by the end of the 1960s was achieved. On July 20th, 1969, Apollo 11 was the first human spaceflight that landed and walked on the moon. The first man to walk on the moon was Neil Armstrong. Next came Buzz Aldrin 20 minutes later.
Flight controllers, go for landing. Retro. Go. Lido. Go. Guys, go. Control. Go. Telcom. Go. GSP. Go. Ecom. Go. Surgeon. Go. Capcom, we're go for over. Okay, engine stop. We copy you down, Eagle. Listen, Tranquility Base here. Can you go ahead? Turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot.
Okay, Neil, we see you coming down the ladder now.
Yeah, I'm going to step off the limb now.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Also, Werner von Braun developed the giant Saturn rocket, which was the launch vehicle that allowed Americans to explore the moon. Also, medical advances were huge in the 1960s. They were that birth control was approved in 1963. Also in 1963, touch-tone telephones were introduced. Also, the first video recorder was produced. In 1967, the first heart transplantation operation.
Till the heavens stop the